Coming up on Arirang News, signs of improvement in the South Korean economy. All three key indicators up in September: production, consumption, and investment. The government now giving out coupons to make sure consumption continues. The United States posts its strongest growth on record in the third quarter at 33% on an annualized basis. Lots of uncertainty, though, between the election and the pandemic. And North Korea says South Korea is to blame for the death of a South Korean man shot and killed last month by North Korean soldiers because it failed to stop him from trying to cross the sea border. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for tuning in to Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. North Korea is trying to blame South Korea for the death of a South Korean official shot dead by North Korean soldiers last month at the maritime border. The regime also claims that it's tried its best to find the man's body, contradicting intelligence that it actually burned his body. Kim Ji-yeon reports.
North Korea said it tried its best to retrieve the body of a South Korean fisheries official who was killed in North Korean waters last month, but to no avail. The North state-run Korean Central News Agency reported Friday the principal responsibility for the official's death lies in South Korea due to its failure to exercise control over a citizen crossing the sensitive maritime border. It added the failure stems from the virus engulfing South Korea and says such an accidental incident shouldn't lead to a repetition of unpleasant precedents that could result in a catastrophe for inter-Korean relations. The North also slammed conservative parties in South Korea, including the People Power Party, for slandering the North and its human rights issues. In a statement sent to the Blue House late last month, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un had delivered his apology for the incident, but has not responded to the South's request for a joint investigation. North Korea's account of the circumstances of the official's death differ from the version released by the South Korean military, in which it had stated the North had burned and discarded the man's remains after firing shots. North Korea claimed that the killing was accidental or unintentional, that the man was shot and killed as the soldiers carried out their duty to guard the border and deal with an illegal intruder. The South Korean Coast Guard in its intermediate findings said evidence shows the official had an intention to defect. In response to the North's recent statement, Seoul's Unification Ministry urged the North to make prompt efforts in uncovering the truth of the case and emphasized that the inter-Korean military communication channels should primarily be restored. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
In other news, South Korea reported 114 new cases of COVID-19 on Friday. The third day in a row there have been more than 100. Of the new cases, 93 were locally transmitted and 21 came from overseas. There was one additional death. Cluster infections continue not only at high-risk facilities like saunas, but also at small gatherings, schools, and workplaces. Officials say they're going to announce a revised set of social distancing measures this weekend. Signs of a modest recovery in the South Korean economy. September saw a rise in overall industrial output, consumption, and facilities investment, all three key indicators. But there still needs to be an improvement overseas before Korea is out of the woods. Kim Jae-hee has the details.
For the first time in 3 months, all three key economic indicators, industrial output, consumption, and facility investment, edged up in September, backed by rising exports.
All the key indicators in production and consumption have increased. Exports of manufactured goods saw their steepest rise in 23 months.
According to Statistics Korea, overall industrial output rose in September from the month before by 2.3%. Retail sales, a measure of consumption, rose 1.7%, mostly on food and clothing. Facility investment rose by the most in 6 months at 7.4%. Finance Minister Hong Nam-ki said on Friday that the indicators all point to an economic recovery and brighten the forecast for the fourth quarter. But experts point out that other major economies are not seeing clear improvements, which could weigh on Korea's own recovery.
The indicators for the third quarter have improved compared to the previous quarter, but that's in part due to the massive slump in the second quarter. And the overall virus situation overseas is not improving in a steady way, so uncertainty remains high.
Also, things are still touch and go for sectors that depend on in-person contact.
In the big picture, it's likely to be a Nike swoosh-shaped recovery, a gradual improvement from the slump caused by the pandemic. But if you look more closely, it's probably K-shaped, with the non-contact industries recovering faster and the industries that depend on contact continuing in a slump.
To keep the recovery going in the fourth quarter, the government is giving out discount coupons for lodging, travel, and food. Starting Friday, you can get 30% off designated sightseeing spots and activities across the country. Also from today, a cashback program for dining out at restaurants. For those who apply, if you eat out 3 times, you can get a refund of around $9 on your fourth meal. Kim Jae-hee, Arirang News.
The U.S. economy grew at its fastest pace in history in the third quarter, up 33% on an annualized basis. Analysts say the recovery is likely to continue into the fourth quarter, though they still see a need for new stimulus. Lee Kyung-eun reports.
The U.S. economy grew at a record pace in the third quarter. Its gross domestic product, a measure of the total goods and services produced in the July to September period, showed an annualized rate of 33.1%. That is the highest figure since 1947, when the Commerce Department began compiling the data. This follows the worst quarter in history, when the American economy plunged 31.4% due to a COVID-19 related disruption to businesses. Experts attribute the rebound to the reopening of the economy and rising domestic consumption. More than $3 trillion of pandemic aid has also contributed to the boost. The figures, which come just 5 days before Election Day, is good news for President Trump, who had repeatedly promised a return of strong pre-pandemic era growth. On the back of the positive economic data, Wall Street rebounded, with U.S. stocks closing higher on Thursday.
We're having a little bit of an interruption right now, but it's an ongoing bull market. We have a long way to go.
The trend is expected to continue in the fourth quarter, but the pace could drop, experts say, based on a diminishing stimulus package and reduced fiscal support. Also potentially taking its toll on growth is the resurgence of the virus that's spreading nationwide. In the meantime, a tougher road lies ahead for recovery in the job market, with 12.6 million Americans still out of work. The unemployment rate remains at 7.9%, far higher than 4.8% when Trump took office. Lee Kyung-eun, Arirang News.
With approval from its shareholders today, LG Chem will be spinning off its battery business as a new entity called LG Energy Solutions. The launch will be on December 1st. The plan was opposed by LG Chem's second largest shareholder, the National Pension Service, but it was still approved overwhelmingly. The company is the world's biggest supplier of batteries for electric vehicles, and it says the spin-off is needed to meet growing demand. LG Chem's stock, however, was down by about 6.1%. Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Mr. Daniel Yu, global strategist at Yuanta Securities. Mr. Yu, good to have you back on.
Good afternoon.
Well, overnight, stocks on Wall Street clawed back some of the big decline we saw on Wednesday. Jobs numbers, GDP recovering. Tell us about that and the action in the global markets.
Right. If you look at just last night, U.S. market has recovered quite significantly. The S&P 500 rose by 1.2%. NASDAQ jumped by 1.6%. That's because that the annual growth rate of GDP came for the third quarter at 33.1% quarter on quarter, which is much higher than expected number of about 31%. So GDP seems to be recovering quite nicely. Year on year is still declining, but nevertheless, it was improving. However, though, if you look at the futures market tonight, the most of indices were down by anywhere between 2 to 2.5%, because continuation of the COVID-19 incident is putting pressure for the global equity market. If you look at the United States, the new confirmed COVID-19 cases surpassed 9 million on Thursday, and at least 81,000 new cases and 1,000 new deaths were reported. So clearly this is putting pressure for the economic recovery, and therefore the global economies are quite concerned about the double dip. And if that's the case, then of course U.S. market as well as global market would show some short-term correction. However, though, continuation of the boosting measures as well as the COVID-19 being the pandemic, but that can be dealt with. We think that the economy will recover, but it might take a little bit of time. So therefore, the recovery pace will be more like a U-shaped rather than the V-shaped.
Now in Seoul today, the Kospi and the Kosdaq both down by quite a bit. LG Chem was part of that decline. We heard that story just a minute ago. What's the story in the local market?
Yes, clearly the corporate governance issue as well as the regulation issue are putting pressure for the Korean equity market. And also today is the last day of October, so the window dressing, more of a downside actually occurred, we think. On the last minute of close, Samsung Electronics were down quite significantly on top of what has been going down. So overall indices were both index for Kospi as well as Kosdaq were down more than 2.5%. So clearly this is a bit of a concern. In terms of that corporate governance issue, and if you look at the LG chemical issues, clearly the splitting the business for the electric car batteries is actually putting some dent to the investor sentiment, and it seems that that's been happening for the overall market in general. So for the time being, it seems that the COVID-19 incident of U.S., the futures market going down significantly by U.S., plus these corporate governance issues and the liquidity is putting pressure. But we think that the recovery can happen as the more of regulations or boosting measures can happen in the future, and the decision making in terms of the 300 million, rather 1 billion of the capital gains tax regulation, they might not change. If that's the case, the market can recover in the future.
Well, now in September, we saw production, consumption, and investment were all up, a triple increase for the Korean economy, as the media are calling it. It's the first time that's happened since June. What do you make of these numbers, Mr. Yu?
Yes, it seems that Korea is definitely better than most of the economy. If you look at the Korea's industrial production number, it jumped 8% year on year. And if you look at the Korea's retail sales number, it rose by 4.4% year on year. And also, if you look at the construction output, it rebounded by 6.3%. And most of the investments are all recovering. So clearly, the third quarter numbers are looking quite good. I think that people are concerned about the fourth quarter because of the COVID-19, the second wave, and if that is affecting the global economy as well as Korean economy, and the export numbers slows if in the fourth quarter, then clearly the GDP numbers are not going to be looking good for the fourth quarter. So a lot of people are talking about the K-shaped recovery or so-called L-shaped right now, and we don't see the potential for the recovery in a global scale. That's the concern. However, though, if the fiscal policy passes, and that is the most important thing, then the Korea will recover much better. And clearly, Korea is very strong in terms of the competitiveness in the manufacturing business and the DRAM and IT segment. And therefore, we think that if the global economy recovers on the fourth industrial revolution, then Korea will be the one that will show the greatest growth in terms of the economic growth. So we'll watch keenly in terms of the additional fiscal budget and fiscal policies in the future.
Indeed. All right, Mr. Yu, thanks so much for making time today, and have a great weekend.
Thank you very much. You too.
Now, the past 3 months for South Korean tech giant LG Electronics were the best third quarter the company's ever had. LG says operating profit came to about $845 million US. That's a jump of almost 23% from the same period a year earlier, and is also the company's best third quarterly profit of all time. Sales were also the best they've ever been for Q3. At just under $15 billion, sales were up about 8% from a year earlier. Analysts say LG's earnings surprise was largely thanks to solid global sales of TVs and home appliances as consumers spent what they had held back in the quarters before. Samsung has overtaken the Chinese company Huawei to take back the #1 spot in terms of global smartphone sales. Huawei had surpassed Samsung in the second quarter by a fraction of a percent, but a report from Counterpoint Research shows Samsung in the third quarter with a market share of 22%. Huawei is second with 14%, followed closely by Xiaomi and Apple. Analysts attribute the jump in sales at Samsung to the new Galaxy Note 20 and Galaxy A smartphones and pent-up demand from the pandemic. And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.